The weight of numbers. I have counted things my entire life. That is what I was made for, what the administratum shaped me into across 17 years of clerical conditioning and rote examination, and it is what I was doing the moment I first understood that counting could be a form of violence. My name is Cassivus Dren. I hold the rank of Senior Auditor Menial, 3rd grade provisional, attached to the Vessel Registry Office of the Rogue Trader Domain of House Valanthar. My work is numbers. Population figures, tithe ratios, materiel assessments, crew manifests cross-referenced against birth records and death registers, and the 10,000 subcategories of Imperial compliance that keep the vast administrative body of the Imperium twitching in its slow, continent-spanning approximation of life. I have audited hive districts, transit stations, agri-world labor pools, and 3 separate void station populations across 6 years of service. I have never once found what I expected to find, but I had never found what I found aboard the Undying Theorem, and I think, if I am honest with myself now, that I never truly expected to return from it. I think some part of me knew, from the first moment I stepped through the primary embarkation hatch and smelled the air of that ship, that the census I had been assigned to complete was not a task, it was a sentence. The Undying Theorem is a Gothic-class macro cruiser. That designation alone should communicate everything necessary to someone of appropriate Imperial literacy. Gothic-class vessels are the workhorses of the sector fleets, enormous and ungainly by the standards of other Imperial warship lineages, built wide in the amidships and deep in the keel, their silhouettes recognizable across vast distances by the cathedral spires that erupt from their upper hull, like the spines of some ancient ecclesiastical creature, dragged half-formed from the void. They are not elegant ships, they are enduring ships. They are built to absorb punishment and continue functioning, to push through engagements that would break lighter vessels, to carry more weight than their frames were ever technically designed to support. The Undying Theorem had been doing exactly that for 4,011 years at the time of my assignment. 4,000 years. I wrote that figure in my intake report and paused over it for longer than I should have, because numbers that large cease to be numbers in any functional sense, and become instead a kind of geological time, the sort of span across which stone becomes sediment and sediment becomes something unrecognizable. The ship stretched 6 kilometers from prow to stern. It carried, according to the official manifest filed with the Valanthar Domain Registry, 134,000 souls. It had 12,582 decks. I was given a data slate, a vox bead with a direct channel to the Lord Captain's administrative office, a portable luminator of military specification, a census packet of 340 blank compliance forms, a standard issue administratum seal stamp, and 4 weeks to complete the survey. I remember looking at those 4 weeks written in the margin of my assignment docket and thinking that whoever had calculated the timeline had either never set foot on the vessel or had calculated the timeline in full knowledge that no one would ever actually complete the work. 4 weeks to survey 12,582 decks, 134,000 registered souls, and the materiel inventory of a 4,000-year-old warship the size of a small city. The mathematics alone should have been sufficient warning. 42 decks per day, assuming 16-hour working periods, allowing no time for transit, no time for uncooperative respondents, no time for sealed corridors, or the particular obstinacy of crew hierarchies that have calcified over centuries into something resembling feudal governance. The assignment was, in the language of the administratum, technically issued in good faith. I believe, in the language of any other institution, it was issued as a formality, a performance of oversight rather than the exercise of it. I should have understood that from the beginning. I did not. That was my first and most consequential error. The Lord Captain of the Undying Theorem was a woman named Elara Sable Valanthar, 7th of her line to hold the vessel's warrant of trade, a tall and angular person of indeterminate age whose face had been partially reconstructed at some point in her past, and whose reconstructed portions carried a faint metallic sheen in certain lighting conditions. She received me in the ship's primary command salon on Deck 3, a vast and heavily gilded space that smelled of recirculated incense and old wood polish, and the faintly acrid undercurrent of plasma exhaust that permeated every environment aboard the ship at some trace level. She poured me recaf from a silver pot without being asked, set it on the table between us without looking at it, and told me in a voice that carried no particular warmth but also no hostility that she welcomed the census, that it was long overdue, that she had personally lobbied for an independent audit of the crew complement for years. She said all of this looking not at me, but at a point somewhere above my left shoulder, as if she were reading from a prepared statement projected onto the air behind me. Then she said something I wrote down verbatim and have returned to many times since. She said, "You will find the upper decks fully cooperative and the middle decks adequately documented." She paused there, the silver recaf pot still in her right hand, her reconstructed cheek catching the salon's filtered light in a way that made it look briefly like polished bone. She said, "Below deck 6000, I would ask you to exercise the particular discretion appropriate to sensitive compliance reviews. I would ask you to document what you find without attempting to alter it." I asked her what she meant by that. She set the recaf pot down. She looked at me directly for the first time since I had entered the salon. Her eyes were dark and very steady, the kind of steady that is not natural but trained, the steadiness of a person who has decided in advance what they will and will not permit themselves to feel about something. She said, "The ship requires what the ship requires." Then she thanked me for my service to the domain, stood, and left the salon without another word. I sat with my recaf and my blank compliance forms, and the particular silence that follows when a powerful person has told you something they expect you to understand without having said it plainly. I have since had a great deal of time to consider those words. The ship requires what the ship requires. I have turned them over in the way one turns a stone in a river current, looking for the edge, the shape, the weight of what lies underneath. And I believe now that what she was telling me, in the practiced circumlocution of the rogue trader nobility, was that she already knew what I was going to find, and that she was asking me, with the particular politeness of someone who has no need to be anything other than polite, to come back from it without asking her to do anything about it. I did not understand that then. I began my work on Deck 1. The upper decks of the Undying Theorem were, by any standard of Imperial naval compliance, impressively maintained. I mean that sincerely, without irony, because by the time I reached the lower sections of the ship, what I found on decks 1 through 400 began to seem almost phantasmal in its normalcy, the kind of pristine orderliness that exists only in contrast to what lies beneath it, the whitewashed surface of a structure whose foundations have been consumed by something that grows in the dark. But I did not know that yet. On decks 1 through 400, I found what I expected to find. Command staff rosters properly updated to within 2 years, weapon battery crews who could recite their munitions inventories with the practiced cadence of people drilled to recite them. Medicae stations stocked to within acceptable tolerance of their prescribed minimums, chapels to the God Emperor maintained with genuine devotion, their candles fresh, their icons clean, their officiating ministers capable of producing current ordination documentation, Mechanicus shrines to the Omnissiah, tended by certified tech adepts whose mechadendrites gleamed with calibration oil and whose ritual chants were precisely the right ritual chants for vessels of this class and age. It was excellent, in the way that excellence looks when it has an audience. I recorded it all. I stamped my forms. I noted the crew populations deck by deck, cross-referenced their numbers against the manifest, found discrepancies in the acceptable range of plus or minus 3% that the Administratum's compliance guidelines permitted for active warships. I drank recaf provided by cooperative deck supervisors. I answered the polite, carefully worded questions of officers who wanted to know how long the audit would take, whether I needed accommodation, whether I would like a meal, whether I had found everything satisfactory. I told them I had found everything satisfactory. The air on the upper decks tasted like recycled oxygen, with a faint mineral overlay from the atmospheric scrubbers, the standard sensory signature of an Imperial void vessel whose life support systems were functioning within nominal parameters. The lighting was consistent, steady white-yellow, from functioning lumens positioned at regulation intervals. The corridors were wide enough for 3 crew members to pass abreast, their floors swept clean, their walls stenciled with deck numbers and directional indicators in the precise Gothic script specified by the Naval Infrastructure Ministry's corridor marking protocols. Protocols issued, I noted, in M38 and apparently never substantially updated. Everything was legible. Everything was navigable. Everything made sense. That condition lasted approximately 412 decks. Deck 413 was where I first noticed the cold. It was subtle. A drop in ambient temperature of perhaps 2 or 3 degrees from what I had been experiencing in the decks above. Not dramatic, not alarming. The kind of temperature variation you might attribute to a faulty environmental regulator, a temporarily disrupted heating conduit, any of the dozen minor systemic inefficiencies that accumulate in a vessel of this age. I noted it in my field log and moved on. But I noticed that the lumens on deck 413 were older than those above. Not malfunctioning, not dimmer exactly, but a different quality of light, the same white-yellow but somehow less confident in it, as if the lumen strips had been installed with a slightly different formulation of their emitting medium and had over the centuries drifted toward a color that was technically still white but carried beneath it, like a harmonic in a musical chord, a faint greenish cast that I could not precisely account for. I noticed also that the corridor marking stenciling changed on deck 413. The Gothic script was the same script but older. The stencils had been repainted over themselves many times. I could see the ghost layers beneath the topmost application, the old text bleeding through the new in a palimpsest of maintenance cycles, and the oldest legible layer used an orthographic convention for deck numbering that I recognized from my clerical training as standard for vessels commissioned before M37. The Undying Theorem had been commissioned, according to its registry documentation, in the early years of M36. The stenciling convention I was reading beneath the paint was consistent with that era, which meant that on deck 413, the oldest layer of corridor markings had never been fully removed. They had simply been painted over, repeatedly, for 4,000 years. The truth arrived quietly. The crew populations on decks 400 through 800 were different from those above, in ways that took me several decks to name precisely. They were not less cooperative, not hostile, not deficient in any formally documentable sense. Their compliance forms were completed, their rosters were current, their tithe records existed and could be produced on request. But they held themselves differently. The crew of the upper decks had the particular posture of people who live in proximity to authority, a slight forward lean in conversation, an alertness in the eyes when an officer walked past, the careful professional friendliness of people who understand that they are being observed by someone with the power to affect their circumstances. The crew of the middle upper decks did not have that posture. They were not unfriendly, but they did not behave as people who thought of themselves as being in proximity to authority. They behaved as people who thought of themselves as very far from it. Their deck supervisors, when I met them, were not officers in the naval sense. They were hereditary positions. I learned this gradually across several decks, piecing it together from the way supervisors introduced themselves, using not rank designations but family names, followed by the word holder, as in Supervisor Cale Moth Holder, Deck 472, or Deputy Supervisor Lana Vale Holder, Decks 490 through 503. I asked one of them, a heavy-set man named Grist Oakenholder who managed a section of secondary coolant relay stations on Deck 516, what the holder designation referred to. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has been asked to explain a concept so fundamental to their existence that they have never needed to articulate it before. He told me his family had held the deck for 240 years. He said it the way a landowner might say his family had held an estate, as a statement of standing, of legitimacy, of the kind of identity that does not require external validation because it has never thought to seek it. I recorded this, I stamped my forms, I kept moving. the cold deepened. By deck 600, it was consistent enough that I retrieved my thermal underlayer from my kit and wore it beneath my tunic. The greenish cast of the lighting had become more pronounced, not dramatically so but undeniably present, and I had begun to notice that the atmospheric scrubbers on these decks produced a slightly different sound than those above, a lower harmonic in their cycling rhythm, a bass register vibration that I could feel in my molars if I stood still long enough to pay attention to it. The air tasted different too. Still breathable, still within the oxygen-nitrogen parameters that human biology requires, but with an underlying flavor that I can only describe as deeply old. A taste like the inside of a sealed room that has been closed for a very long time, not stale in the simple sense of oxygen depleted, but saturated with the accumulated atmospheric residue of generations of human occupation, the metabolic output of hundreds of thousands of people across thousands of years, compressed into the very chemistry of the air itself. I ate my meals from the ration packs I had brought. I had stopped accepting food from deck supervisors sometime around deck 550, not from any specific concern, but from a general instinct that I did not examine closely enough at the time. On deck 700, I found my first sealed bulkhead. It was not on any manifest I had been provided. It occupied what should have been, according to the structural schematics in my data slate, a primary transit corridor connecting deck 700 to a lateral section of secondary crew quarters, designated on the plans as Accommodation Block 7-. The bulkhead was old, far older than the surrounding corridor infrastructure, its surface a deep gray that had oxidized in a way that spoke of extreme age, and it was sealed, not simply locked, sealed. The frame had been welded shut at 8 points around its circumference, the welds done in a style and with a material composition that my data slate's rudimentary assay function identified as consistent with welding techniques commonly employed in shipboard emergency bulkhead operations during the early millennia of the ship's operational life. The welds were from the inside. I could tell from the characteristic bead pattern of the weld material, the way it had pooled and set on the near face of the frame, that whoever had sealed this bulkhead had done so from the opposite side. From within Accommodation Block 7-, which the schematics showed as a standard crew residential section, rated for a population of approximately 1,800. I noted this in my field log. I stamped a non-compliance notation on the relevant form. I moved on. The silence grew heavier. I found 2 more sealed bulkheads before deck 800. Both were welded shut from the inside. Both were not on any manifest. I noted them. I moved on. I was still at this stage operating in the framework of the assignment, as I had understood it from the beginning, a compliance census with an expected finding of moderate irregularity, the kind of irregularity that accumulates in large vessels over long operational periods. I was cataloging anomalies. I was not yet considering what they meant when placed in sequence with each other. That understanding came on deck 840. I had been moving through what my schematics designated as an engine support servicing corridor, a long arched passageway that ran parallel to a cluster of secondary plasma conduits and was intended to provide maintenance access to the conduit housing brackets. The corridor was not currently in use for maintenance. It was in use, I discovered when I turned a corner and stopped walking, as a shrine. The word feels inadequate for what I found. Shrine implies a modest arrangement of devotional objects. What I found was an entire ecosystem of faith that had been built, incrementally, across what I estimated to be decades or possibly generations of accretion, covering every centimeter of the corridor walls and ceiling in a layered accumulation of votive objects, inscribed panels, hand-painted imagery, woven textiles, hammered metal tokens, preserved organic material of kinds I chose not to examine closely, and, most significantly, notation. Binary cant rendered in the standard Adeptus Mechanicus symbolic format, column after column of it, chalked and painted and scratched directly into the metal of the corridor walls, extending from deck plating to the topmost curve of the arched ceiling, covering not just the stretch of corridor immediately visible on my entry but, I discovered as I walked its length with my luminator raised, the entire 340-meter run of the passageway. The notation was not standard. I am not a tech priest. I do not have the deep cognitive interfacing with the cult Mechanicus's technical liturgy that would allow me to read binary cant with full fluency. But I have clerical training that includes basic familiarity with Mechanicus notation systems, sufficient to recognize common sequences and to identify their general categorical purpose. The notation on these walls was recognizable as Mechanicus in format but not in content. The sequences were not maintenance logs or operational parameters or any of the technical liturgical forms I could identify from my training. They were something else, invocatory in structure, the way devotional texts have a rhythm that differs from instructional texts, but addressed to a subject I could not identify from the fragments I could pass. The subject was referred to by a symbol I did not recognize, a compound glyph that appeared to be a fusion of the standard Mechanicus representation for a plasma drive's ignition manifold with something older, something that looked like a pre-unity astronomical symbol for a celestial body of extraordinary mass. A sleeping thing, a vast, contained, inexhaustible thing. I photographed the entire corridor. I noted it on my compliance forms as an unauthorized shrine installation in a working maintenance corridor, recommended remediation, stamped the form, and continued. Nothing was as it seemed. The crew populations below Deck 800 were different again. The change had been gradual, but by this depth it was pronounced and undeniable. The people who lived and worked on these decks were not the same population as those above in any simple cultural sense. They were Imperial citizens. They carried identification tokens stamped with valid Imperial registration codes and the Valanthar domain crest. Their tithe records existed and were formalized in the appropriate Imperial ledger style. But their mode of life was something that had developed in relative isolation over an extended period and had diverged from the standard naval crew culture of the upper decks in ways that went well beyond the usual regional variation one expects to find in a large vessel's interior population. Their names were different, not foreign, not Xenos-influenced, but evolved in the specific way that language evolves within a closed population over generations, the phonemic drift that occurs when a community's naming traditions are no longer refreshed by outside cultural contact. They had names like Seveth and Quarren and Olis and Madreth and Binnock, names that were recognizably derived from standard Gothic naming conventions, but that had been shaped by 4,000 years of isolation into something that felt like a dialect of familiarity rather than a foreign tongue. Their ecclesiastical practice was officially documented as worship of the God Emperor of mankind, as required by imperial law. The altars in their chapels bore the Aquila. Their officiating clergy, when they had clergy, used the correct liturgical forms. But their understanding of the God Emperor had been filtered through several thousand years of insulation from the broader imperial theological tradition, and had developed local characteristics that a visiting ministorum representative would have found, to put it charitably, theologically creative. They understood the Emperor as a being of light who dwelled above them in the regions of the ship they called the High Bright, which was their term for the upper decks. They believed that his attention, his blessing, his active providence was most accessible through the plasma drives, because the plasma drives were warm and constant and produced light and kept them alive, and these are the characteristics that human religious instinct has always attributed to the divine. The plasma drives, to the people of the middle decks, were not merely the engines of their vessel, they were the breathing of a god. I sat with one of their clergy on deck 912 in a chapel that smelled of machine oil and something sweet that I later identified as a derivative compound produced by the biological action of certain lichen species on the copper alloy used in older bulkhead construction, and I listened to her explain her theology with the patience and care of someone who rarely has occasion to explain it to an outsider. She was an older woman named Queth Binnock Tallow, her title rendered in the local dialect as something approximately equivalent to Keeper of the Warm, and she wore vestments that combined the black and white of standard ministorum practice with panels of a shimmering copper-toned fabric that she told me was woven from reclaimed plasma conduit insulation fiber. She told me that the drives breathed in cycles of approximately 17 minutes, and that each breath was a blessing, that when the harmonic vibration of the drive cycle moved through the deck plating, it was the heartbeat of something immense and patient and eternal, counting its congregation. I asked her whether the God Emperor, as understood in the broader Imperial faith, was separate from the drives or expressed through them. She considered this for a long moment. Then she said, in the degraded Low Gothic that was the primary language of these decks, and that I had by this point gotten reasonably good at following, that she thought the question was perhaps not one that the drives themselves would consider meaningful. She said the distinction between a body and the spirit that inhabits it was not something she found useful when thinking about very large and very old things. I found this theologically irregular, and noted it as such on the appropriate form. I also found it, in a way I was not prepared to find anything on this assignment, genuinely moving. I had been on the ship for 11 days by the time I crossed into what I began to think of as the deep middle, the band of decks from roughly 900 to 3000, where the ship's infrastructure began to show its age in ways that were no longer merely aesthetic. The lumens here were unreliable, not absent, not inconsistent failure, but cycling in patterns that did not correspond to any maintenance schedule I could access. They would burn steadily for hours and then dim, not all at once but in rolling sequences that moved through the corridor sections like a slow wave, a tide of reduced light that passed through a given area over the course of several minutes and then receded, leaving the lumens bright again, but somehow different, as if they had come back from the dark changed. I began keeping my portable luminator charged and available at all times. I began sleeping in 4-hour intervals rather than full rest cycles, because the rhythm of the lumens in the quarters I was allocated on each deck felt like a presence, something that moved in the shifting light in the way that large things move through dark water, not with intention but with the passive weight of their existence. The cold had become a constant, not dangerous cold, not cold that would cause physical harm, but the sustained baseline chill of a space that had not been fully heated in a very long time, that had developed its own thermal equilibrium around a temperature that was comfortable for nothing but survivable for everything. My breath did not mist. The cold was not that kind. It was more like the cold of a cave system, the deep geological cold of spaces that have been separated from the surface world long enough to develop their own internal climate, independent of what occurs above. On deck 1044, I found the first population that required my cipher assistant to communicate with. I had been assigned a cipher savant, a young man named Pell Ostric, who served in the Valanthar domain's administrative staff, precisely because my intake briefing had noted that some midship crew populations used sufficiently degraded linguistic variants to require translation assistance. I had not expected to need him until much deeper in the vessel. On deck 1044, I found a residential community of approximately 3,000 souls whose primary language had diverged from recognizable Low Gothic to such a degree that I could identify individual words but could not reconstruct sentences. The drift had gone primarily phonemic, the vowel sounds collapsed in certain registers and exaggerated in others, creating a language that used the same fundamental consonant skeleton as Low Gothic, but whose flesh was something new, something that had grown in the dark and developed its own musculature. Pell Ostric listened to their speech for approximately 20 minutes, working through it with the systematic patience of someone applying a structural framework learned through long training to a novel problem. Then he told me that the language was definitely derivable from Low Gothic through a series of evolutionary steps consistent with approximately 8 to 12 generations of isolation from the broader linguistic community, that the grammar had simplified in some respects and complexified in others, and that the vocabulary had developed approximately 300 new terms for which no Low Gothic equivalents existed. I asked him what those 300 new terms referred to. He looked at his notes. He said, mostly things the upper decks don't have names for, experiences specific to this depth, states of the infrastructure, qualities of the air, the behavior of the lumens. He paused. He said, and things they encounter below this level. Things they have names for that they did not learn from their ancestors' Low Gothic vocabulary, because their ancestors did not know about them. I asked him what things. He said he was still working on the translation. He said he would let me know. He never fully finished, but he told me enough. The undying theorem's Mechanicus complement, the tech priests and their associated servitor pools, were nominally responsible for the maintenance and spiritual care of all technical systems aboard the vessel. In practice, above Deck 2000, this responsibility was exercised with the competence and devotion one would expect of a properly staffed Mechanicus delegation. Below Deck 2000, the Mechanicus presence became sparse, then intermittent, then effectively absent. I met the last formally ordained tech priest operating at these depths on Deck 2011, a skeletal figure named Enginseer Votive Thurn, whose augmentations were largely functional, but whose personal documentation had not been updated to reflect his current posting in over 80 years, meaning that by the Mechanicus's own internal records, Thurn existed in an administrative state that was neither confirmed present nor confirmed dead, but simply unrecorded, a human-machine entity who had slipped through the gaps in the bureaucratic substrate that was supposed to account for him. Thurn received me in his personal maintenance cell on Deck 2011, with the distracted courtesy of someone whose attention is primarily elsewhere. His optical mechadendrites moved continuously while he spoke to me, tracking things I could not see, and his speech was punctuated by brief intervals of binary cant that he did not appear to be consciously producing. He told me he had been stationed at this depth for 41 years. He told me his primary responsibility was the maintenance of a cluster of secondary coolant distribution manifolds in the adjacent deck sections. He told me this with a precision and detail that suggested it was the answer he had prepared and rehearsed, the answer that accounted for his presence here without requiring a more complicated explanation. I asked him whether there were active Mechanicus operations below his current deck level. He was quiet for long enough that I began to wonder whether he had heard me. Then he said, in a voice that had the peculiar flat quality of binary cant translated in real time into Low Gothic by an interface implant that was not quite functioning at full specification. There are operations. Whether they are Mechanicus in any sense I can fully sanction, I have chosen not to determine. I asked him what that meant. He said, below Deck 3000, the notation on the walls becomes formally correct but contextually incorrect. The symbols are right, the sequences are wrong. Whatever writes on those walls understands our language perfectly and uses it for purposes that are not ours. I sat with that statement for a long time after leaving his cell. Something writes on those walls. I crossed Deck 3000 on my 18th day aboard the ship. The architecture changed at Deck 3000 in a way that was distinct from the gradual drift I had been tracking through the preceding thousands of decks. It was not a sudden change, not a clean demarcation, but a transition zone of perhaps 60 to 80 decks, in which the physical character of the ship underwent a shift that I can only describe as geological. The materials of construction remained the same adamantite alloy and void-bonded ceramite and ancient ironwork that the ship had been built from, but their arrangement changed. The corridors became lower, broader, their proportions shifting from the standard naval specification dimensions towards something wider and deeper, the ceiling dropping incrementally as the walls expanded outward, as if the ship's interior had been slowly compressed and spread by the weight of everything above it over 4,000 years of constant mass loading. The flooring in the corridors had deformed, not catastrophically, not structurally, but in the way that very old metal deforms under sustained load, the deck plates bowing slightly at their centers, the seams between them no longer tight, but separated by gaps that varied from hairline fractures to finger widths that revealed darkness below. Through those gaps, when I knelt with my luminator held at the right angle, I could see down through the space between the deck plate layer and the next structural surface beneath it, and in that space I sometimes saw things moving, not dramatically, not in ways that would have registered if I had not been looking for them. Small movements. The kind of movement made by something small and habituated to darkness that has learned to freeze when light appears above it. I did not investigate those spaces. I recorded their existence and moved on. The cold at Deck 3000 had become something qualitatively different from the chill of the middle decks. It had texture. I am aware of how that sounds, and I set it down as precisely as I can because precision is what I have, and imprecision would be a betrayal of what I found. The cold at this depth was not simply low temperature. It was cold that felt as if it had a source, a specific directional origin somewhere below, something that produced cold the way a heater produces warmth, with intention, with direction, with a quality that meant you were not simply experiencing an absence of heat, but a positive presence of something that was not heat. I wore everything I had. It was sufficient to be functional. It was not sufficient to be comfortable, and comfort had been irrelevant to me for several days by this point in any case. The resident populations at Deck 3000 were not documented. Not irregularly documented, not underdocumented, not documented with the informal hereditary record-keeping I had found in the middle decks. Not documented at all. I found communities here with no official existence, no identification tokens, no tithe records, no census entries. Thousands of people living in the deep ship with no administrative footprint, no bureaucratic trace, no record that they had ever been counted or categorized or acknowledged by any imperial institution. They were not hiding. They were not in rebellion. They were simply, from the perspective of the imperial administrative apparatus, not there. They occupied their spaces with the settled confidence of people who have never been told they did not belong somewhere, because they have never been told anything at all by anyone who would have occasion to say it. They looked at me with curiosity, not suspicion, not fear. Curiosity, the way an isolated community looks at a traveler who has come from further away than they can easily conceptualize. I understood gradually, a figure from the mythology of the upper world, from the high bright, from the realm where the god-emperor's representatives moved and spoke with authority. Several children on Deck 3012 followed me at a distance as I moved through their community, maintaining a gap of perhaps 10 meters, whispering to each other, and occasionally calling out in their linguistic dialect, which Pell Ostrich was still working to pass fully. He told me, afterward, that some of what they called after me was greeting, some was a form of blessing invocation, some was a question that translated, approximately, as, "Do you know the way back up?" He said that last phrase did not appear to be directed at me. He said it appeared to be directed at someone they believed I was accompanied by. I told him I was alone. He said he knew. On Deck 3300, I found the first shrine room that was papered in Mechanicus notation that no tech priest I could contact had any knowledge of. I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters enormously. I had encountered Mechanicus notation throughout the middle and deep middle decks, in shrines and maintenance chapels, and the corridor-length devotional inscription I had documented on Deck 840. All of that notation, while irregular in application, used standard Mechanicus symbolic forms in ways that were at minimum derivable from standard applications, however theologically creative the derivation. What I found on Deck 3300 was different. The room was a former equipment storage bay, its original purpose evident from the bolt anchor points where racking systems had once been mounted and had long since been removed. It measured approximately 12 meters by 20, with a ceiling height of 4 meters, and every surface, every centimeter of floor, wall, and ceiling had been inscribed with Mechanicus notation. Not painted or chalked, inscribed. The notation had been cut into the metal of the surfaces with a precision that exceeded what I would have attributed to manual work. The lines clean and consistent, the depth uniform, the spacing exact to a degree that suggested either machine-aided inscription or a steadiness of hand that human physiology does not straightforwardly produce. The notation covered everything, not randomly but in an organized system, the floor containing what appeared to be a foundational text that covered its entire surface in dense, tightly spaced rows, the walls bearing secondary texts arranged in panels, separated by plain margins, the ceiling carrying what appeared to be a culminating or summary text of some kind, its arrangement different from those below, its symbol density lower but its individual characters larger, written with the clear intent that they be read from below while looking upward. I photographed everything. I relayed the photographs by VoxLink to the Mechanicus delegation on the upper decks. I asked them to review the notation and tell me what it said. They responded 12 hours later. The response came from a tech priest of moderate seniority, whose identification code designated them as Adept Feranthis, and it was the most linguistically unusual official communication I received during my entire assignment. Adept Feranthis told me that the notation used the correct symbolic vocabulary of the Adeptus Mechanicus in correct syntactic arrangements. They told me that the notation was readable in the same way that a text in a known language is readable to a literate person, that they could identify its component parts and understand their individual meanings. They told me that when they attempted to understand what the notation said as a complete text, rather than as a collection of individually comprehensible parts, they found that it described something for which they had no referent, not something they did not understand, as a novice might fail to understand a complex technical treatise. Something that could not be understood, in the sense that the text was coherent, but its object was absent from the conceptual framework available to them. They said, "The text is about something that does not exist within Mechanicus knowledge. It is a precise technical description of something we have no category for." They said, "I recommend you leave that room." I had already left, but I appreciated the advice. The deeper I went, the more the ship stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like an organism. I do not mean this in any metaphysically specific sense. I mean it as a phenomenological report, a description of how the experience of moving through those decks changed as I descended. Machines have a logic to their noise, their temperature variations, their physical vibrations. A machine is a system, and systems, even very complex systems, have a character of purposefulness to them, a sense that each component exists in relation to the others in ways that serve a function. What I was experiencing by Deck 4000 was different. The vibrations of the hull at this depth were not the regulated mechanical vibrations of a functioning ship. They had become something more like the vibrations of a living body, irregular, responsive, varying in rhythm with changes I could not identify in any of the environmental parameters I was monitoring. The hull would shudder in long, slow pulses that did not correspond to the plasma drive cycles I had learned to count in the middle decks. The cold would intensify in brief surges and then retreat. The darkness, in the sealed sections beyond functional lumens, was a different quality of darkness from what darkness normally is, which is simply the absence of light. This darkness had a quality, a presence, a sense of being on the near side of a very thin barrier between what I was and what was beyond it. I am an auditor. I am not given to mysticism. I say this not defensively, but as a relevant fact about my interpretive framework, because it means that when I report a qualitative experience of the kind I am reporting here, I have first run it through the filters of my training and found that those filters do not successfully account for what I am describing. I am not projecting meaning onto neutral phenomena. I am reporting what I encountered as accurately as my faculties allow. On Deck 4012, I documented a sealed bulkhead that was different from those I had found before. The previous sealed bulkheads had been welded from the inside using recognizable welding techniques consistent with the tools and materials available to shipboard crews in the relevant historical periods. This one had been sealed differently. The frame had been filled, not welded, filled with a material that had been introduced in liquid form and had set hard over what must have been a considerable period of time, because it had thoroughly occupied every gap in the frame's sealing surface and had flowed slightly from the bulkhead's near face onto the surrounding floor before setting, forming a thin tongue of solidified material, approximately half a meter long on my side of the seal. I examined this tongue closely with my illuminator. The material was dark and dense, with a surface texture that was not quite metal and not quite ceramic and not quite any other material I had specific training to identify. It was warm to the touch, measurably warmer than the surrounding deck plating, and I noted this in my field log with careful precision, because at 4,000 decks below the upper hull surface in a ship whose ambient temperature had been steadily declining, finding something warm was notable. I asked Pell Ostrick, who had been with me continuously since Deck 1044 and had become in those days a quiet and reliable companion, what he thought the material was. He crouched beside it for a long time without speaking, Then he said, "It was poured from this side. They filled the frame from this side, which means whatever sealed this was not sealing something out, it was sealing something in." He paused. He said, "Whatever is on the other side did not want to leave." I recorded this. I moved on. I tried not to think about the warmth under my fingers, the warmth of something that should have been cold but was not. By Deck 5000, I had revised my population count upward 3 times in response to finding residential communities that had no record in any document I had been provided. These were not hidden populations in the sense of concealment from authority. They were hidden in the sense that authority had simply not gone where they lived, had not sent anyone to count them for so long that the counting had ceased to exist as a concept in relation to them. They lived in the machinery of the ship the way organisms live in the body of a host, occupying the spaces between larger structures, making use of heat and power outputs they had not been assigned, but which were available, drinking recycled water from secondary condensation systems that had originally been intended for industrial rather than human use, but which were, at this depth, the only water available and had been consumed by these populations for so long that any concern about their chemical composition was an artifact of a cultural memory that had long since dissolved. These populations were, in terms of basic human biology, doing remarkably well. I expected the degradation that overcrowding and poor nutrition and inadequate environmental conditions produce in isolated populations over long periods. What I found was different. Not robust health, not the vitality of populations with access to adequate resources, but a kind of specific adaptation. They were not thriving by the standards of the upper decks. They were thriving by the standards of where they were. Their bodies had adjusted. Their metabolic requirements appeared to have reduced. Their tolerance for the cold, the darkness, the altered atmospheric composition of the deep decks was evident in the absence of the respiratory conditions and the immune system dysfunctions I would have expected to find. They had become, across generations, people specifically suited to this place. They had become, in a strictly biological sense, creatures of the deep ship. I noted this in my field reports with the language of a compliance observer. Deck-adapted crew subpopulation, exhibiting physiological variation within acceptable range of human biological parameters, recommending medical assessment upon integration into standard crew health monitoring systems. I used the word integration deliberately, because at this depth the populations I was encountering were not integrated into any aspect of the ship's official crew structure. They existed in a relationship to the undying theorem that was not employment or assignment or even conscription. It was more like the relationship of the ship's own immune cells to the ship's body. They were there because the ship needed something done that nothing else could do, and they had been doing it for so long that neither they nor the ship's official command structure thought of it in those terms anymore. It was simply the condition of things. Nothing was as it seemed. Ostrich began having difficulty sleeping around Deck 5200. I noticed it first when he began accompanying me on night surveys, which I had been conducting alone until that point. He said nothing about why he had changed his pattern. He simply appeared in the corridor outside my allocated quarters at the beginning of my night survey window, his luminator charged and his translation notes tucked under his arm, and walked with me. We did not discuss it. I think we both understood without discussion that being alone on these decks at night had become something neither of us was comfortable with, not from any specific incident, but from the accumulated weight of the days below, the way each deck had added something to what we were carrying, and what we were carrying had become heavy enough that sharing the weight made both of us more capable of continuing to function. He was 23 years old. He had not signed up for this assignment in any sense that his original employment agreement with the Valanthar domain had disclosed to him. He had been a cipher savant for 4 years, had worked on 3 prior postings that involved translation of archaic administrative documents, and one that had involved a brief field posting to a labor camp on an agri-world where he had been required to translate a local dialect for purposes of tithe renegotiation. He was not a field operative. He was a linguist with good administrative instincts who had found himself 2,000 meters below a 6-kilometer warship's upper hull because the senior auditor he had been assigned to support had not been granted the authority or the good sense to stop. I think about Pell Ostric often. I think about the particular quality of his silence on those night walks, the way he moved his luminator to check corners before entering new corridor sections, not in the dramatic style of someone performing caution, but in the quiet, automatic way of someone whose instincts had been recalibrated by prolonged exposure to an environment that rewarded attentiveness. I think about what I asked of him, and about whether I would make the same decisions again, and I think the honest answer is that I do not know, because by Deck 5000, I was no longer operating as the person who had stepped aboard the ship 11 days earlier. Something about the descent was cumulative. Each deck took something and left something in its place, and what it left was not nothing, but it was different. By Deck 6000, I was a different person than the one who had arrived. The Lord Captain had told me that below Deck 6000, I would need to exercise discretion. I had interpreted that instruction at the time as a polite way of telling me that I would find compliance irregularities of a politically sensitive nature, the kind of operational accommodations that large, old vessels make with their internal populations that do not survive close scrutiny from administratum auditors. I had interpreted it as a sophisticated superior's way of preparing me for the reality that the compliance census was going to produce a great deal of non-compliance notation, and that someone with authority over me would prefer that notation to be recorded in the most generously interpretive language available. I had not interpreted it as a warning. It was a warning. On Deck 6001, I found a population that I want to describe carefully, because I am aware that what I set down here will be read by people who were not present, and who will need to evaluate my account without the benefit of having stood in that place and seen what I saw. I want to be as precise as I can. I want to resist the impulse toward dramatic framing that the subject matter seems to invite. I want to be an auditor, because that is what I am, and because the auditor's discipline of accurate, dispassionate recording is the only thing I have left to offer in relation to what I found. The population on Deck 6001 numbered, by my count, approximately 4,200 souls. They occupied a section of the ship that the structural schematics designated as a secondary magazine cluster, a series of interconnected storage chambers originally intended for ammunition storage, supporting one of the vessel's starboard lance battery banks. The lance battery had apparently been decommissioned at some point in the ship's distant past, because the magazine systems were not in use for their original purpose, had not been in any form accessible to me, and the population living there had been in residence for long enough to have thoroughly adapted the space to purposes that would not have been sanctioned by the Naval Infrastructure Ministry's magazine occupancy standards, or by any other standards I could name. They were physically identifiable as human. I want to be clear about that. They had 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. They breathed atmosphere and drank water and ate food, though the food, I learned, was something they cultivated in the lower sections of their magazine chambers, using a form of bioluminescent fungal agriculture that had been developed, apparently independently, from the naturally occurring fungal communities that had established themselves in the perpetual darkness of the deep ship over the course of the vessel's history. They spoke a language that Pell Ostric spent an entire night working on and declared, at the end of that night, with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they would have preferred to avoid, to be related to Low Gothic in the same way that a distant cousin is related to a specific family, sharing ancestry but not mutual intelligibility. They carried Imperial identification tokens. I cannot stress this enough because it is, in the architecture of everything I found on this ship, one of the most significant facts. These people, on Deck 6001 of an Imperial warship, 6 kilometers below the command salon, where the Lord Captain received me with recaf in a silver pot, carried Imperial identification tokens. Stamped metal tokens of standard Imperial registration format, bearing their names, their assigned deck designations, their tithe categories, and the embossed seal of the vessel authority. The tokens were old, very old. The metal was dark with age and the stampings had been worn smooth in some cases by generations of handling, but they were readable, and the dates on them, the commissioning dates that the Imperial registration system places on new tokens at the time of an individual's first formal enrollment in the Imperial administrative structure, were consistent with the ship's original commissioning period. The commissioning dates on those tokens were 4,000 years old. These were not the tokens of those people's ancestors. They were not inherited relics. The registration numbers on the tokens corresponded to the specific individuals who presented them to me, in the sense that when I asked for a token and an individual produced one, the name on the token was the name they gave me when I asked their name. The names had been worn down to initials in some cases, but the initials matched, and the dates were 4,000 years old. I do not know what to do with this. I mean that in the most literal possible sense. I have been a compliance auditor for 17 years. I have never found anything that my training and my frameworks could not eventually accommodate, could not eventually categorize and note and stamp with the appropriate designation and move on from. What I am describing cannot be accommodated. A population of 4,200 people in continuous, uninterrupted occupancy of a section of this ship since its original commissioning 4 millennia ago, maintaining their imperial registration through that entire period, having adapted over 4,000 years to conditions of perpetual darkness and cold and isolation to a degree that has produced observable physical divergence from standard human biology, without dying, without losing their administrative registration, without being discovered or documented or acknowledged in any census record I have ever seen, while also, and I need to emphasize this, while also appearing to be, by any metric I could apply, alive, present, functional, and aware. There are things that this observation invites me to conclude. I did not write those conclusions in my field report. I did not write them because I am an auditor, and my field reports are documents of fact, and what I am approaching is not fact in any sense that my training has equipped me to formalize. It is something adjacent to fact, something that lives next to what I know to be true in the same way that the deep darkness lives next to the light of my luminator, close but not the same. I moved on. I want to note for the record that moving on, at this point in the descent, required an act of will that I am not sure I have adequate language for, not physical will. My body was functional, cold and tired, and subsisting on rations that were technically adequate, but not palatable, but functional. What required will was the continuation of the framework, the continuation of the audit as a conceptual structure, the commitment to proceeding as if what I was doing was still what I had been assigned to do, as if census taking on deck 6001 was continuous with census taking on deck 412 in some meaningful sense. I believe that maintaining that framework, however strained, was what made it possible to continue. I believe that if I had allowed the framework to collapse, if I had allowed myself to sit down in that magazine chamber and ask what I was actually doing and why I was continuing to do it, I would not have gotten up again. So I moved on. Pell Ostrich had stopped speaking in full sentences around deck 6400. He communicated in fragments, single words, sometimes, affirmatives and negatives, occasional directional indications. I had not asked him to stop speaking, and I do not believe he had made a conscious choice to do so. I think the linguistic reduction was a kind of compression, the way under sufficient pressure a material reduces to its most essential components, and what remained in Pell after deck 6000 was only the most essential components of communication, only what was functionally necessary to continue performing his role. He was still translating. That did not stop. He produced written notes from his work, handed them to me on pages torn from a spare notebook, pages covered in his precise small handwriting, and these translations were, even in this reduced state, invaluable. Because the populations below deck 6000 were speaking about things that the upper decks did not have words for, and understanding what they were saying about those things was the closest I could get to understanding what those things were. The word that appeared most frequently in Pell's translations, across all the populations below deck 6000, was a word he transcribed phonetically as Undran. He told me it was not Low Gothic and not any other language he could map it to definitively, but that in context it functioned as a proper noun, a name, and that it was used consistently with the reverence and contextual specificity that names are used with when the named thing is present. Not when it is being discussed in abstraction, when it is being addressed. The populations below Deck 6000 used this word the way you use the name of something that is in the room with you. I did not ask Pell what he thought it meant. He was translating, not interpreting, and I needed the translation to continue. But I think about the word often. I think about the way it sounded when I heard it spoken, even before I knew what it was, even before Pell gave me his first note about it. There was a quality to how people said it in those lower decks, not fearfully, not reverently in the prostrate sense, but with the specific ease of a word used for something so familiar that its familiarity has become foundational, the way you say the name of a river you grew up beside, the name of a mountain you have always been able to see from your window. I reached Deck 7000 on my 23rd day. I had stopped filing regular compliance reports with the Lord Captain's administrative office 2 days earlier. My Vox link to the upper decks was still functional, but communication was increasingly intermittent, the signal disrupted by something I could not technically identify, a form of electromagnetic interference that my Vox bead's diagnostic function attributed to a source it could not locate. The interference was not constant. It came in waves, irregular, not rhythmic in any way that suggested a mechanical source, and in between those waves the signal was clear. During those clear windows, I filed abbreviated reports. I reported population figures. I reported compliance status in broad summary. I did not report the specifics of what I was finding, partly because I did not have the vocabulary to describe the specifics within the formal compliance reporting framework without generating a response from the administrative office that I was not prepared to receive, and partly because by this point I was not entirely certain that what I put into a report would reach the office in a form consistent with what I had written. I am not sure what that means. I am noting it because it is true. On Deck 7012, I found something that had been waiting for me. I use that phrasing deliberately, not because I have evidence of intent in any formal sense, but because of what I observed. The chamber was at the end of a corridor section that my schematics did not show as inhabited, did not show as having any designated function at this depth, simply labeled it as a structural void space, one of the many gaps in the ship's anatomy that accumulate over time as systems are rerouted and sections decommissioned. It was, according to my instruments, 32 meters long, 18 meters wide, and 12 meters high. Its floor was clear. Its walls were covered with Mechanicus notation that I recognized immediately as being of the same type I had found on Deck 3300, the notation that Adept Feranthis had been unable to account for categorically. At the center of the chamber's floor was a single chair. It was a standard administratum field chair, the folding metal type issued to census auditors for fieldwork. It was not new, but it was not old in the way everything else at this depth was old. It was the kind of old that a chair gets from use, from being sat in repeatedly by a specific person over a specific period. The joints were worn at characteristic points. The seat surface had the particular depression of a frequently used seat. It was facing inward, away from the entrance, facing the far wall of the chamber. I walked to the chair. I stood behind it. I looked at the far wall. The far wall bore a single inscription, different from the notation surrounding it. Not Mechanicus binary, a name, in perfect, clear, uncorrupted High Gothic, Cassivus Dren. My name, my full name, in the form in which it appears in my official administratum registration. Below the name, also in High Gothic, a single sentence: "We have been waiting for the one who counts." I turned and left the chamber and walked for approximately 4 hours without stopping. Pell followed me without asking questions. I do not know how far I walked. I do not know whether I was walking towards something, or away from something, or simply moving, because stopping felt impossible. When I eventually stopped, in a stretch of empty corridor somewhere in the low 7000s, I sat down on the deck, plating with my back against the wall, and put my face in my hands and stayed that way for a long time. Pell Ostrich sat down beside me. He did not speak. He turned off his luminator, and I turned off mine, and we sat in the darkness of Deck 7000 and some number I had stopped tracking, in the cold, in the silence, which was not precisely silence, because the hull groaned at this depth with a frequency and persistence that had long since ceased to register as external, and had become simply the ambient sound of existing here, and I thought about my name on a wall on a ship that was 4,000 years old. I had been expected. That is what I kept returning to. Not the question of what had written my name there, not the question of how it had known my name, not even the question of what it meant that something at this depth in a 4,000-year-old warship had been anticipating a specific census auditor from the Velanthar Domain Administrative Office. I kept returning, much more simply, to the fact of being expected, because it meant that this ship had known someone was coming before someone came. And if the ship had known, or whatever lived in the ship's deep places had known, then the question of whether the Lord Captain had known became relevant again, and the particular words she had used, "The ship requires what the ship requires," returned to me in the darkness with a new quality to them. I had not been sent on an audit. I had been sent as a delivery. Something below deck 7,000 had waited a very long time for someone to count it, and the Lord Captain had known that, and had issued the assignment, and had poured me recaf in a silver pot, and asked me to exercise discretion, and I had proceeded down through 12,000 decks, one form at a time, to arrive at a chair facing a wall bearing my name. What was I delivering? Myself, my count, my audit. The recognition that census provides, the act of official acknowledgement that says you exist, you are numbered, you are real, within the framework of the empire that produces such numbering. What lives below deck 7,000 of the undying theorem has apparently been real for 4,000 years in every sense that matters to it, in every sense that matters to the ship, in every physical and functional sense, but it has not been counted, it has not been numbered. In the entire 4,000-year history of the vessel, no one has come to the deep places with forms to fill, and a seal stamp in their pocket, and the delegated authority of the Imperial Administratum to declare that what is here is officially here. No one, until me. I sat in the darkness for a long time. Then I turned my luminator back on, picked up my data slate and my census forms, and went deeper. The truth arrived quietly. Below deck 7,000, the ship changed again. I cannot describe this change in architectural terms, because it was not primarily architectural. The physical infrastructure of the ship remained recognizable, the same materials, the same basic structural logic, even if worn and deformed and modified by unimaginable spans of time and use. The change was in the quality of presence that the space had. Above 7,000, even in the sealed corridors and the notation-covered chambers, I had been moving through spaces that felt empty in between the populations I encountered, corridors and chambers that were uninhabited, but were uninhabited in the way a room is uninhabited when no one is currently in it. Below 7,000, the uninhabited spaces did not feel empty, they felt full, but full of something that I was not perceiving with the sensory systems I had been born with. I am not going to attribute this to the supernatural. I am going to attribute it to biology, because I believe that is the more accurate attribution, and because I am an auditor. Human biology is capable of perceiving things that human consciousness cannot articulate, and 4,000 years of something very large and very old living in the belly of a very large and very old ship is sufficient to produce environmental conditions that human sensory biology can register without human conceptual frameworks being able to name. The feeling of fullness in those corridors was a biological response to a stimulus I could not identify. That is my account. Pell Ostrich's translations of the populations at these depths had become single-word annotations rather than sentence-level rendering, because the language being used by the people we encountered was no longer structured in sentences in any way he could confidently map onto the low Gothic grammar he was using as his analytical frame. The language at this depth had developed, or possibly reverted, or possibly had always been, something that communicated in a way that was not purely sequential, not purely linear, in a way that I will not pretend to understand linguistically, but that I will describe experientially as follows. When the people at this depth spoke, I understood things. Not the words, not any translation, but I understood things. the way you understand the emotional content of music without passing its theory. Something was being communicated that my linguistic processing was not involved in receiving. I noted this in my field log as possible atmospheric compound affecting cognitive processing, recommending atmospheric composition analysis. The atmospheric composition analysis function on my data slate had stopped responding to input at some point around Dec 6500. I noted that too. The populations below Dec 7000 were the populations that were keeping the ship alive. I understood this not through any single dramatic revelation, but through the cumulative evidence of everything I had been documenting for 23 days. The plasma drives of the undying theorem, the drives that the middle deck populations worshipped as the breathing of a divine body, required something at their base level, at the fundamental operating level that existed below the technical systems that the Mechanicus maintained in the upper decks, that the Mechanicus could not have provided, and could not have acknowledged providing, without requiring a category of thing they did not have. What the drives required at their deepest level was what lived at the deepest levels of the ship, in a relationship to the technology that was neither operation nor maintenance nor the standard Mechanicus interfacing liturgy, but something older and more fundamental, something that had developed, or that had always been, the relationship between a body and whatever animating principle sustains it. The ship's plasma drives burned with a consistency and a stability that was, by the technical specifications of Gothic-class vessels, approximately impossible for a ship of this age. Gothic-class macro cruisers in service for more than 1,000 years typically required extensive and continuous Mechanicus intervention to maintain plasma containment stability, and most vessels of this antiquity had reduced their drive output substantially simply because the systems were no longer capable of sustaining full operational parameters without constant intervention. The undying theorem ran at full drive capacity. It had been running at full drive capacity continuously for 4,000 years. That was the official record. I had never had reason to question it. Now, on Dec 7000 and beyond, I understood what produced it. Whatever sustained the drives was down here. Whatever I was moving toward was what the Lord Captain had meant. The ship requires what the ship requires. On Dec 8000, I encountered a figure that I want to describe as carefully as I have tried to describe everything else, because getting this wrong would be the most consequential inaccuracy in a document that has already pushed the limits of what I understand to be documentable. The figure was in the middle of a long corridor, standing. Standing is the correct word. It occupied the space in the way that standing implies, upright, bilateral, facing down the corridor. It was approximately human in outline. I use approximately advisedly. The outline was human in the way that a shape seen through thick glass is the shape it actually is, true in its basic geometry, but distorted in its details by the medium through which it is observed. I do not think the medium in this case was glass. I think the medium was time. 4,000 years of time, and whatever time does to things that live through it, when they live through it, in the belly of a machine that is also living. It looked at me. I knew it was looking at me, despite the difficulty I had in determining exactly what constituted looking for this figure, because everything about my being in that corridor changed when its attention was directed at me, in the way the character of a room changes when someone in it becomes aware of you. The ambient sound shifted, the cold in the corridor moved, something about the darkness at the corridor's far end, beyond my luminator's reach, adjusted. Pell Ostrich gripped my arm. I could feel his fingers through 2 layers of thermal underlayer, which gives you some idea of the force of his grip. He did not speak. He was not translating. There was nothing to translate. Whatever communication was occurring in that corridor was not linguistic. I did what I had come here to do. I raised my data slate. I asked, in the clearest low Gothic I had, whether I could record this individual for the compliance census of the undying theorem. I asked for a name. I asked for a deck assignment. I asked for a tithe category. I am going to report what happened next as precisely as I can. The figure moved toward me, not rapidly, not threateningly, but with the particular deliberateness of something that is not accustomed to needing to hurry, because it has always had time, all the time that there is. It came to within 2 meters of me and stopped. At 2 meters, my luminator's light reached it fully, and I saw what I could not have made out at longer range, what the distance had rendered as outline and impression. It was wearing an Imperial identification token. On a chain around its neck, the way senior ratings sometimes wore their tokens rather than carrying them in a belt pouch. The token was dark with age and worn smooth on its face, but it was there, the same style as those I had seen on deck 6001, and it bore a date that I did not need to examine closely because I had already seen enough tokens at this depth to know what date they bore. I reached out and took the token carefully in my fingers. The figure held still and let me. The token was warm. I read the name on it by my luminator's light. I entered it on my census form. I entered the deck designation. I entered the tithe category as active functional, which is the designation I had been using for all populations below deck 6000 who were demonstrably contributing to the ship's operational function, even in the absence of formal assignment documentation. I stamped the form. I was stamping a census form on deck 8000 of the Undying Theorem for a being of indeterminate age whose Imperial identification token was 4,000 years old, and I was doing it with full awareness that this was the most fundamentally absurd act of my professional life, and I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, by the particular framework of rightness that governs an administratum compliant census, which holds that every person within the jurisdiction of the audit who presents for documentation will be documented, without exception, in the order encountered and with the information provided. The figure stood patiently while I completed the form. When I finished, when I had stamped the seal and tucked the form into my document case, something happened that I will note here and allow the reader to interpret as they see fit. The cold in the corridor retreated, not all at once, not dramatically. It simply was present at one moment and, over the course of perhaps 30 seconds, diminished, not to warmth but to neutral, the comfortable neutral of a properly regulated space. The lumens in the corridor, which had been cycling in their irregular tide-like pattern since I had crossed deck 3000, steadied. They burned with a consistency that I had not seen since deck 400. They did not flicker, they did not dim, they simply burned, steadily, as lumens should. The figure turned and walked away from me down the corridor. It was gone within 30 steps, not because it moved quickly, but because it moved into the darkness beyond my luminator's reach and did not come back. I stood there for a long time. Then I said, to Pell Ostrich, who was still gripping my arm, "I think we need to go deeper." He made a sound that was not quite a word, then he let go of my arm and straightened and turned his luminator back on, and we went deeper. Below deck 8000, the formal census became impossible in any traditional sense, and I want to be honest about that, because my professional integrity requires me to note where my documentation becomes approximate rather than precise. The populations at these depths were not unwilling to be documented. They were, in many cases, actively present for documentation, appearing at the edges of my luminator's light in the way that I imagine deep-sea organisms appear at the edge of illumination, drawn to the light, not because they need it, but because the light is novel, because it marks the presence of something from above that has come down to them. But the documentation forms I had been provided by the administratum were not designed for these populations. They had fields for name, deck assignment, tithe category, trade function, ecclesiastical registration, dietary allocation code, and a series of secondary compliance checkboxes related to weapon registration, psycha status, and alien contact declaration. Psycha status. I stared at that field for a long time on deck 8400, surrounded by a population of several hundred individuals who had gathered in a large chamber to be counted, who stood or sat in calm, patient arrangements while I moved among them with my data slate, and I understood that psycha status as a category, as a specific binary classification with a specific imperial administrative meaning, was simply not a frame that could be applied here with any precision. I ticked the relevant box for each individual in the way that would produce the least disruptive administrative outcome and moved on. The truth arrived quietly, again and again, in different forms, at each depth, and each time it arrived, it was the same truth wearing different clothing. The ship was alive. Not alive in the metaphorical sense in which people speak of machines that have served faithfully for a long time, not alive in the animistic projection that crews make onto vessels they have bonded with, not alive in any comforting or poetic sense. Alive in the sense of possessing an interior life, a continuity of experience, a perspective on its own existence that was the product of 4,000 years of being occupied by, and sustained by, and in turn sustaining the populations that lived within it. The undying theorem had been alive, in this sense, for a very long time, and what lived at its deepest levels was the expression of that life, the part of it that was most aware, most present, most specifically itself. I do not know whether this constitutes heresy. I am going to note that consideration and then set it aside, because I am an auditor, not a theologian, and the question of whether what I am describing falls within the boundaries of legitimate imperial cosmic understanding is not a question I have the authority or the expertise to answer. What I can tell you is that what I found at the bottom of the undying theorem was not inimical to the imperium of man. It was not heretical in any operational sense. It was not a threat to the vessel, or its crew, or the mission of House Valanthar. It was, by every measure I could apply, a functioning and loyal component of an imperial warship, the most fundamental component, the component without which the ship could not function, had never been able to function, would cease to function, within what I estimated would be a very short operational period if it were disturbed. The Lord Captain knew this. The Mechanicus delegation on the upper decks had, in the person of Adept Feranthis, demonstrated awareness of it to the degree that their training permitted. The entire command structure of the undying theorem knew what was in the bottom of their ship, and had always known, and had maintained the fiction of a crew manifest that listed 134,000 souls, because those were the souls it was administratively convenient to list, because the actual population of the vessel included things that the administratum's compliance forms had not been designed to accommodate. I spent 3 days in the deep decks below 8,000. I moved through sections of the ship that no manifest had ever acknowledged. I documented populations that no census had ever reached. I stamped forms for beings that carried 4,000-year-old identification tokens and stood patiently in the glow of my luminator while I recorded their names, their deck designations, their tithe categories, their trade functions, doing it carefully and completely and with the full authority of the administratum seal stamp I had been issued. I counted them. That is what I was there to do. I counted them. I found, when I completed the count, that the total population of the undying theorem, willing or able to be documented as fully compliant with imperial administrative standards, was 4,412, out of a manifest of 134,000. The discrepancy was not primarily a product of the deep populations being non-compliant in any formal sense. It was a product of them being non-documentable in the standard sense, because the standard compliance framework had not been built to accommodate what they were. The 4,412 who produced compliant documentation were mostly, though not entirely, from the upper decks. There were also, among those 4,412, a small number of individuals from the very deepest levels, whose documentation was compliant in every technical respect, whose imperial identification tokens were valid and readable and correctly issued, whose tithe records existed in the appropriate format. They simply represented, in terms of when those records had been issued and what those records described, things that were not possible under standard human biology and standard imperial administrative timelines. I counted them anyway, all 4,412. On my 31st day aboard the ship, I began the ascent. The ascent was faster than the descent. I do not know whether this reflects a change in the ship itself, or simply a change in me, a changed capacity to move through what I had already moved through, a loosening of the resistance that had made each downward step a small decision. The populations I passed on the way up looked at me differently from how they had looked at me on my way down, not with more or less deference or more or less curiosity, with recognition. I had been among them. I had counted them. They knew what I had done, and they knew, I believe, what it cost and what it meant, and they watched me pass with the expression that communities wear when they have received something they have waited a long time for and are not sure yet what it will change. The ascending journey took 11 days. I arrived back on Deck 3 on my 42nd day aboard the vessel. I had been at sea, as it were, for nearly 6 weeks longer than my assigned 4-week window. My ration packs were exhausted and I had been eating, for the last week of the descent and the first days of the ascent, from supplies provided by the midship populations, dried fungal matter, and what I had been told was a form of protein cultured from the ship's secondary waste processing outputs that tasted, neutrally, of nothing I had ever eaten before. I was thinner than I had arrived. My thermal underlayer had worn through at the elbows. My Luminator's power cell had been supplemented twice from midship charging stations that ran off tapped power lines and should not have been operational but were. Pell Ostrich arrived on Deck 3 still producing translations. He had not stopped, across the entire ascent, producing translations. He handed me a final packet of written notes on the morning we crossed back above Deck 1000, notes covering the last 3 days of the deep descent, translations of things that had been communicated in the populations below Deck 8000 that he had still been working on. I took the notes. I have them still. The Lord Captain received me in the same command salon where she had first received me, the same incense, the same recaf from the same silver pot. She looked at me, and I saw in her look a careful assessment of what I had come back as versus what I had gone down as, and whatever she found in that assessment, she did not voice it. She poured the recaf and set it in front of me and sat across the table and waited. I told her my count. 4,412 compliant documented souls from a manifest of 134,000. She nodded. I told her about the sealed bulkheads, the notation, the populations, the chair with my name on the wall above it, the beings on deck, 8,000 with 4,000-year-old identification tokens. She nodded to each of these in turn. She had the expression of a person receiving a report they have requested and expected, and that confirms what they already knew in sufficient detail to constitute a formal record. I told her I was going to file the census results with the Valanthar Domain Administrative Office. She said, "I understand." I told her I was going to recommend that the audit be marked incomplete due to population characteristics incompatible with standard compliance documentation frameworks. She said, "That is appropriate." I told her I was going to recommend that the position of Senior Auditor Menial be quietly dissolved, because I did not think it was appropriate for any person to go down into that ship again under the pretense of a routine compliance census, and I thought the best way to prevent that from happening in the future was to ensure that no one held the administrative position that could be assigned the task. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I will support that recommendation." I asked her if she had known what was in the bottom of the ship before she sent me down. She looked at me with the same dark steadiness that had characterized her eyes in the first meeting. She said, "I have known what is in the bottom of this ship my entire life. My mother knew. Her mother knew. Every holder of this warrant has known, back to the first Valanthar, who commissioned this vessel's refit in M37 and found that the refit crew never fully came back up." I asked her whether the deep populations, whether what lived below Deck 8000 were dangerous. She said, "If by dangerous you mean a threat to those who leave them undisturbed, then no. If by dangerous you mean a threat to those who do not, then the question answers itself." I asked her what Undren meant. She looked at me for a long, steady moment. Then she set down her recaf cup and said, "Where did you hear that word?" I told her, "Everywhere, from Deck 6000 down." She looked at the table. She said, "It is the name they use for the ship, not the Undying Theorem. That is our name. Undren is what the ship calls itself, passed up through the populations from whatever understanding the deep ones have of the thing they live within." She paused. She said, "It means the one who will not finish dying." I have thought about those words many times since I left the undying theorem, the one who will not finish dying. An entity that has been in the process of dying, perhaps, from its moment of commissioning, as all things begin dying from the moment they begin living, but that has refused, through 4,000 years of void travel and combat, and the ordinary grinding erosion of existence, to complete the process. Sustained by what lives within it in the same way that what lives within it is sustained by it, a circular ecology of persistence, of refusal, of the particular dogged continuity that the imperium of man has made into both its greatest virtue and its most terrible characteristic. I transmitted my final census report on emergency astropathic burst before I left the vessel. The transmission reached the domain administrative office 3 days after I boarded the shuttle that would carry me back to the nearest port of call. The report listed the total compliant population as 4,412. It recommended the audit be marked incomplete. It recommended the dissolution of my own position. It also contained one additional paragraph that I want to set down here exactly as I wrote it. I wrote, "The undying theorem carries within its lower decks a population of indeterminate size whose contribution to the vessel's operational continuity is total and irreplaceable. These populations do not appear on any current manifest and cannot be documented under standard Imperial compliance protocols. They are, by any measure applicable to this situation, the most essential crew complement aboard this vessel and the primary reason it has remained operational for 4,000 years in defiance of standard Gothic-class longevity projections. Any administrative or operational action taken against these populations, or any interference with their habitation, would in the auditor's assessment result in the immediate and irreversible loss of all drive function and the subsequent permanent loss of the vessel. The auditor therefore recommends that all future administrative interaction with the undying theorem be conducted at the level of the vessel's command structure, without independent census or compliance activity at depths below deck 400, and that the record of this audit be sealed at classification level appropriate to sensitive domain operational assets. The auditor further notes, for the record, that the populations at these depths are aware of the Imperium of man. They have carried Imperial identification since the vessel's commissioning. They have maintained, in their own way and in the depths of their own understanding, a form of loyalty to the thing that they are part of and that is part of them. They have asked for nothing except, it appears, to be counted. That request has now been satisfied. I submitted the report. I left the ship. My position was dissolved 14 days after I returned to port in a brief administrative communication that cited operational restructuring within the Velanthar domain auditing function and thanked me for my service. No investigation was opened. No follow-up audit was commissioned. The compliance record for the undying theorem was updated to show the audit as complete with notation of incomplete status, which is an administrative category that means the record exists but nothing about it requires action, the bureaucratic equivalent of a closed door. I returned to the room I had rented at the port. I sat down. I placed my data slate on the table in front of me and looked at the final population figure on my census report. 4,412 out of 134,000. I looked at it for a long time, this number that was the most complete and most inadequate number I had ever produced, this number that represented only the portion of a truth so much larger than any number could contain. I thought about Pell Ostrich. He had been reassigned immediately on our return, faster than was usual for administrative staff, to a posting in a different sector of the domain that I was told was routine. I have not been able to reach him since. I hope that his new posting allows him to sleep. I hope that the translations he finished on the way up have stopped accumulating in him the way translations of unfamiliar things accumulate, building up in the structure of understanding like mineral deposits in a pipe, slowly changing the nature of what flows through. I think about the chair on deck 7012 often. The administratum field chair, worn at its characteristic stress points, facing the wall where my name was written in high Gothic that had not faded, that appeared to have been inscribed, rather than applied, as if the metal of the wall itself had been reshaped into the forms of those letters, with a precision that spoke of intention, patience, and the kind of time that has nothing to do with urgency. Someone had known I was coming. Something in that ship, in its deep bones, in the accumulated intelligence of 4,000 years of inhabited darkness, had known that eventually someone would be sent down with blank forms and a seal stamp, had prepared a place for that person to sit, had written a name on a wall that was not yet a name because the person it belonged to had not yet been born when the inscription was made, and had waited. Waited the way the ship waited, the way everything aboard the Undying Theorem in its deepest regions waited, with the patient, inexhaustible persistence of things that have no reason to hurry because time, to them, is simply the medium in which they exist, the ocean they swim in, the air they breathe. The one who will not finish dying. I have counted many things in my life: census populations, tithe assessments, materiel inventories, the 10,000 categories of compliance and non-compliance that constitute the administrative skeleton of the Imperium of man. I have never counted anything that counted me back. I have never produced a census that the census population was waiting for, that had been anticipated and prepared for across more generations than I can imagine, by something that understood what a census was, and what it meant, and what it cost the one who performed it. They had asked only to be seen. That is not a small thing. To a population that has existed for 4,000 years in the deepest dark of a ship that the Imperium acknowledges only in its upper portions, to be seen by someone carrying the authority, however modest, of the Administratum's seal stamp is to be named in the same way that the Emperor's light names things, to be brought from the conceptual dark into the formal record, to be made real in the administrative sense that the Imperium uses to mark the boundary between what exists and what merely persists. I made them real, imperfectly, incompletely, in a census report that will be sealed and forgotten in a domain archive that no one will access for a very long time, but real. I wonder sometimes what changed aboard the Undying Theorem after I left. Whether the lumens in the deep decks burn more steadily now, whether the cold at deck 8,000 is a little less cold, whether the plasma drives, the great warm breathing things that the middle deck populations worship as a god's lungs, burn with a quality that is a fraction different from how they burned before. Whether something in the deep ship, in the thing that calls itself Undren, noticed the change in what it carries, the addition of 4,412 officially documented names to the formal record of its existence. I wonder what it thought of my count. I wonder if it thought my count was enough. I hope that whatever lives at the bottom of that ship, whatever has kept it alive across 4 millennia of void darkness and the grinding entropy of existence, understands that I counted as fully as I could. I hope it understands the limits of my forms, the inadequacy of my frameworks, the gap between what I found and what I could formally record. I hope it understood, on the day I sat in that field chair and worked through my census packet with my luminator burning steadily in the dark of deck 8,000, that the inadequacy of the record was not the same as the inadequacy of the witness, that I saw more than I could write and understood more than I could categorize, and that what I carried back up from those depths was real and would stay real inside me in a way that no administrative closure could undo. I am no longer senior auditor menial of any grade. The position has been dissolved. I have no current assignment. I sit in a rented room in a port city, on a world whose name I will not give here, and I write this account, and I think about Undren, the one who will not finish dying, burning through the void on drives that should not be capable of sustaining their output, carrying within it the populations of a dozen lost civilizations that have developed in its belly like seeds in the dark, feeding on the warmth of plasma drives that are themselves fed by something that no tech priest will acknowledge and no manifest will record. I think about Lord Captain Ilara Sable Valanthar, pouring recaf from her silver pot, telling me in the most careful possible terms that the ship requires what the ship requires. She was right, it does, and now, for the first time in 4,000 years, someone has written it down. I will not be going back. I say this not with certainty, because certainty requires a confidence in my own future decisions that 4,000 years of patient expectation has somewhat eroded, but with preference. I prefer not to go back. I prefer to sit in this room and drink recaf that is nowhere near as good as what the Lord Captain poured me, and write this account, and remember the weight of my field chair on the deck plating of Deck 7012, and the warmth of a 4,000-year-old identification token in my fingers, and the way the lumens steadied in that corridor on Deck 8000 when the last form was stamped. I prefer to remember the names I recorded. The count is complete, or as complete as it will ever be. The audit is marked incomplete. The position of senior auditor menial has been dissolved. The undying theorem continues its service to House Valanthar, to the domain, to the broader mission of the Imperium of Man, pushing through the void on drives that burn with a continuity that is, by every technical standard, impossible, sustained by what the upper decks do not acknowledge and the lower decks have always known. 4,011 years, 12,582 decks, 134,000 on the manifest, 4,412 counted, and Undren, the one who will not finish dying, burning on,